Okay, welcome everybody, and thanks for joining us for our session today on Rundeck Core Concepts Tailoring Projects. There's actually a lot of things we could talk about around projects since projects are so important inside of Rundeck. I obviously don't have enough time to cover everything this time, but we'll cover more another time. For now, I wanted to get at some basics that are important to understand. I think there will be material here that's helpful even for folks that are longtime users, but it is definitely focused on someone who is new to Rundeck and trying to understand the concepts and which of the pieces you need to put into play in the early days of setting up a Rundeck environment. As is often the case with these sessions, we have a lot of folks attending. We do encourage questions, but I think everybody's muted essentially to start. So if you have a question, feel free to interrupt me, or I will pause periodically and again at the end to take questions. And I'll do my best to answer your questions during the session if I can. If there's something I can't, if I need to take it offline, I'll get your contact information and follow up with you after the session. All right, so we'll go ahead and get started. So from an agenda perspective, I'm going to go through some definitions first. There's some language we use that isn't always clear necessarily if you're not used to Rundeck, so I want to be clear on some of those things. Then we'll talk about creating a new project, defining a default node executor, which by that point we'll know what a node executor is, defining nodes and model sources, using readmes and the message of the day, and lastly, I'll talk a little bit about how you might track your project configuration. So first thing is a project. If you've used Rundeck at all, you probably have run into what a project is. A project is kind of a logical container in Rundeck. The main things that are contained in them are jobs and nodes. You're very familiar with jobs. You're probably also familiar with nodes, and we'll talk about what they are in just a minute. Everything that you do in Rundeck in general, barring an administrative activity, is done within the context of a project. Logs are there, etc. You can have lots of projects on the same server, but project access is limited based on access control that you've set up. So in general, projects are often based upon who the team is that is working on a specific project and its associated jobs. But that's not necessarily the way it works, but that's a common way to look at it. So what is a node? A node is the things that we manage with Rundeck. They could be physical or virtual. They're typically servers, but they wouldn't have to be. In some cases, nodes are a network device. They could be just about anything. I've seen instances where even a user might be considered a node. In general, nodes are going to be something that you assign to a particular project. And we'll talk about how we do that today. You might have the same nodes in more than one project, but you're defining it in each case in the context of a project. And as part of that definition, you're defining how you're going to connect to it, what username and password you might use, or what private certificate or whatever the things are that are necessary to connect to those nodes. The connectivity information might be largely the same for every node in a project, or there might be some differences depending on what you need to do and how you need to do it. So you can make it very complicated, although today we won't necessarily be talking about those complexities. So node executor is something that comes up. We don't usually talk about it a lot because it's something you usually set up when you first set up your project. And maybe you don't even have to think about it depending on what you're doing. But the node executor is what allows you to execute a command and or a job on a node. By default, the node executor that's there for a new project is the SSH node executor. There's actually two of them, but there's a basic SSH node executor that is used. And if you're using SSH for your connectivity, you don't need to choose anything different, although you might need to do a little bit of configuration to make sure it's got the right certificates or keys or whatever you need to use. In general, your node executor is defined by the default node executor that you specify for a project. And every node that's in that project will inherit that default. But you can override that if there are certain machines within a project that you wanted to handle differently. For example, if most of your nodes were using one set of credentials, but there were some that needed a different, possibly higher set of credentials, you might handle that with a different node executor or with a different certificate, either of which you could override at the node level. So again, I don't know how likely it is you're going to want to do that override, but it's important to understand that the capability of Rundeck will allow you to make those changes if you need to. The last definition is, what is a model source? There are a lot of things in Rundeck terms that we talk about as resources, and one of those types of resources is a model source or a node source. A model source has node definitions for the project. When you first set up a project, there's one that's there already. All that one does is allow you to use the Rundeck server as its own, as a node that you could target as a quote unquote local node. So it's a little bit different than typical nodes, but that one's there. You can add as many additional node sources as you want. And if you have multiple node sources, Rundeck's going to aggregate the data from all of those to provide a merged view. So you might have data that's coming from AWS, if that's where your nodes exist, and also some information that's coming from, some other tool that you're using that has additional data, or you might even have a file that has additional data on top of that. As long as they're all clearly referring to a common node by its name, then we're going to merge that data together and you'll have all that data available to you for targeting your nodes when you're doing jobs. At its most basic, a model source is a file. It's going to be an XML, a YAML file, or a JSON file. You could have multiples of those, or you could have one. I'll show you an example of a YAML file in a little bit. The file is going to be a set of nodes. Under each definition of a node, it's going to have attributes and/or tags. There are some required attributes that you need to have there in order to make these things work. And then beyond that, you can add whatever you want. And those other attributes you use might be used for you to decide how to target nodes, which nodes to target on a particular job or things like that. Beyond a file, your node source could be more of a CMDB that has more information about your nodes. If you're in AWS, you can connect to AWS EC2 and get your node definitions from there. If you're using a VMware environment of some kind, you can get your information about your nodes from VMware. So depending on the nature of your nodes, if it's possible, it's always ideal to get the data from sources that are already there and are accurate. And then you might decide you want to supplement that with some files. But depending on your circumstance, sometimes a file is the most straightforward way to approach it, and then you just have to decide how you're going to maintain those files as changes happen. All right, that's it for definitions. So the first thing we'll talk about beyond definitions is creating a new project. So it is important to recognize that you can't create a project if you don't have the right permission. So if you're logging in as the user called admin that comes as a default, that user can do everything. You can create projects. But if you are a different user, you may or may not have that permission depending on how your access control is established and written. So we've done other sessions on ACLs, and you might want to go back and listen in on one of those if you're not sure how to make those adjustments, or follow up with us and we can help you figure that out. But that's important. In general, there's probably only a couple people in an environment who will be able to create projects. There may be plenty of people that can work inside those projects, but usually there's only a few that kind of have that root level access, if you will. If you have the capability, you will typically see in the interface a new project button at the top of the project list page, or in the left-hand panel above the list of projects you currently have, as you can see in the screenshot. When you hit that new project button, you're going to see a screen like this. You'll notice across the top of it, there are different sections that let you define different aspects. It starts on the details area, which is what we see here: project name, label, and description. The rest of it, you might or might not make changes to. I think one of the ones you will likely look at and should look at is default node executor, which I'll get to in a few minutes. You'll notice this project name and label, and this can be a little bit confusing, but the main distinction to remember is a project name can't have any spaces or special characters. It can have numbers, it can have letters, but nothing beyond that. The label is more robust than that and can have both spaces and special characters. So in effect, the label is kind of the friendly name that's going to be more visible to most users, and where you can make it anything you want, including having spaces. So I think best practice is probably to use a label if your project name is more than a single word. And then there's a description, and we'll see where that shows up. That's obviously optional. You can also create a project through either the command line interface or the API. And I'm not going to show an example of the API, but it's effectively the same idea. If you have the CLI interface installed, then you can just create a project by using rd projects create -p project name. That'll give you all the defaults for your project that creates the project. You then see it in the GUI or be able to access it in the CLI. The second example shows how you could use some additional attributes. In this case, giving the project a label and specifying the SSH key path. But any attribute that's out there that could be part of a project configuration, you could specify here. So if you're going to do a lot of project creation, I think there's definitely some value in doing it through the CLI. You can figure out kind of what it is you want to tailor as far as your project creation and create those things through the CLI rather than going through the GUI interface. But what you can do, what you're capable of is the same. It's just, if you know you're only tweaking 4 things, it's probably going to be faster, more efficient to do it in the CLI than it would be sticking with the GUI. So we'll talk about a default node executor. As I said earlier, the node executor is defining what protocol you're going to use to connect to your nodes. The default is SSH. If you're an enterprise user and run a Windows Rundeck server and wanted to connect to Windows target nodes, you might use PowerShell as your node executor, and then there's a few other options. So that's what node executors are. I can define my node executor when I create a project by going to the default node executor section here. And I've broken out this drop-down menu to show what the different options are that were available on my particular server. Remember that what you see in this list is based upon plugins you have loaded in your environment. So your mileage may vary, I guess is the point, depending on what environment you're in and what custom plugins you have. You might see a longer or shorter list. You can also edit the configuration and specify the node executor after you've created a project. So I often have created a project and not specified the node executor when I did it, either because I forgot or because I wasn't sure which one I was going to use. So if you've got a project already, once you've selected a project, once you're in a project, you can go to the project settings on the bottom left, choose edit configuration. It gets you back to essentially the same sections that we were looking at when we created. And again, we can choose default node executor to pick something here. From a kind of startup perspective, remember that in addition to specifying the node executor, you might need to specify some other values on the same page, depending on which executor you choose. So if you're doing SSH, as in this case, there's a default key that it points to in the SSH key file path. And you might want to point to a different one, or maybe more likely you want to point to a key that you established in your key store. And in either case, setting it up so it's pointing to the right key is going to ensure that you can connect to your node successfully with this node executor. So that's something worth keeping in mind. You'll also notice when you're looking at it in the top right, there's something that says edit configuration file, which puts you into advanced configuration. That's going to give you this text version of the project properties, and you can edit things here if you know what you're doing. Might be simpler to do this than going through the different sections in the GUI view, but it's a matter of perspective as to which is easier. All right, we'll talk about node definitions and model sources. So I've already got a project in place, and I want to add a new source. I need to go into the project. In this case, it's a project called Maintenance Project. And down under Project Settings, I'm going to choose Edit Nodes. What you see in the main part of the screen is what you will see in your environment if you've created a project and not done any node definition at all. So the only node source that's here is the local source, which is the one that points to your server itself. I can add a new source by clicking on the green button. When I do that, I get a list of node sources. These are the sources that are available to me, again, based on plugins that are enabled in my environment. So again, what you see might be different than what I see, and this isn't the full list. I just picked enough that I could fit on one screen. But you see some examples like ServiceNow, AWS, Azure, Ansible. Those are all pretty common examples. If you've got those in your environment, then you might want to look closely at these node sources, or the one at the bottom is kind of the lowest common denominator, which is a file. Unless you're connecting to one of the special resources like ServiceNow or AWS, etc., at bottom, the node sources are going to be defined as a file that's either XML, YAML, or JSON format. Whichever one of those you're most comfortable with is fine. They're all going to use the same attributes, but obviously the formatting is going to be a bit different. I'll show you an example in a moment of a YAML version, which is what I usually do, but whatever is most comfortable to you is fine. So this is a node definition file, and we've had other sessions on defining nodes that get into a lot more detail, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it right now, but you could go back and watch the recording or hit us up for questions. But you'll notice in each section, I'm defining a host name and then giving it attribute information, including in some cases attributes with sub-attributes. So there's an FQDN attribute that has both private and public underneath it, an IP that has private and public. You don't have to do it that way. That's what I did. Among the ones that are required attributes, you have to have a host name, you have to have a node name, you have to have an OS family and a username. I think off the top of my head that's the full set, but you can check that in the documentation if you need to. And then you can add tags or other attributes as you want to allow you to manage your nodes or target your nodes with jobs. So that file in the right format is what I would point my project to as a node source, and it would process those all and always use whatever the live version is of that file and its data to define my nodes. Okay, I said I would talk a little bit about the README and message of the day. I think these are features that are overlooked. They're not necessary for everybody, but I wanted to point out how they come into play so that you could determine if there's something that might be useful in your environment. So first, in order for the README or message of the day to be made visible and therefore useful to you, you do need to come to the user interface section under project configuration and check the boxes for the places that you want these things to be visible on. So for the README, do you want it on the projects list or the project homepage or both? And the same with message of the day. And I'll show you what that looks like here. So the left-hand side is the list page. These are my list of projects. If I look at the maintenance project, which is the one I was playing with for this example, next to the maintenance project is the description field that we saw earlier, and below it are the message of the day followed by the README. On the right side, I'm seeing the project homepage, what I see when I first log into that project. At the very top, I'm seeing the message of the day, and toward the bottom, I'm seeing the README. You might or might not use both. The message of the day, as it is implied, is something that's expected to change periodically. The README is intended to be something that sticks with the project and probably doesn't change that often, that tells people what the project is about and how to use it, maybe some instruction, where the message of the day might be more an alert, if you will, telling people, hey, we're going to have downtime, or you should keep this in mind for the next few days, or whatever types of things you might need to communicate to your users. To edit those, assuming you made them visible, in both cases, you're going under project settings. You're either choosing edit README or edit message of the day, and then typing in what you have and saving it. You'll notice at the time that I took this screenshot, I hadn't enabled visibility of these messages. And so it has a warning at the bottom to tell me, hey, if you want this to be visible, you need to enable it in project configuration. I already showed you where that is, but if you see that message, then it's worth going and doing that, assuming you want to take advantage of that feature. All right, we're almost at the end. And if people have questions, if it seems relevant, I'll take us over to a live Rundeck environment. But the last thing I want to talk about a little bit is tracking project configuration. So as you change your project settings, things like what will be your default node executor, any of that stuff, those changes aren't necessarily being tracked. And so it depends on how often you're having those changes. In many environments, it doesn't change very often, and there's very few people who can make the changes, so it may be a non-issue. When you install a new Rundeck version today, project settings, all of this configuration stuff that we've been talking about is stored in your database. Historically, it had been stored in the file system in a file called project.properties, and you could still make it happen that way, but that's not what happens by default. So if you're storing it on the file system, you could then diff that project.properties file against an earlier version and know what's changed. But you can get effectively that same information a few different ways, even if you're storing the data in the database. So one approach to take, and I don't know necessarily that I'd say this is the best option, but in some ways it's the simplest one, is to choose the option to export your project archive. Again, it'll be in that left-hand menu. There's an export project option. That brings me to the page I'm seeing on the left. If the only thing you do here is choose configuration, if you uncheck everything else, what you'll get effectively is a jar file that contains the project.properties file, which I'm showing on the right-hand side. This may look familiar to you because this is what we saw when we went into advanced configuration earlier on in one of the other screens. So this data is available a few different ways. You could get the same information out by doing an export using the CLI. You could do an export using the API. So there's several ways that you can do this. And if you're doing it on a periodic basis and saving those files, then you could, if you need to, roll back to an earlier configuration. Maybe not something you need to worry about. I think it would be nice if we just made this, if there was an easy backup of this happening like we do with some other things, and we may do that in the future. But I'd certainly say if you're making significant change to your project configuration, it might be worth backing up what you have now before you make those changes, include in case you do anything that has unintended consequences. It's nice to be able to know that you can roll back. I think that is the last thing I had. Questions. If you got a question, you can feel free to pop it into the Q&A. I think you might also be able to unmute yourself if you wanted to speak up on the audio, and I'll give it a couple minutes here if anyone wants to speak up. Okay, so I did see a question in the chat. The question was, if we import a configuration, will it automatically update the database? And the answer is yes. If you're in the mode that I described, which should be true in any case where you've got a relatively new Rundeck, it automatically overrides what you did have, and the place that it will override that is into the database. So if you had exported the settings in the way that I just described or showed here, you could then import that same thing and it would override that piece for you.